to be back, and actually, it's my third time. I did another presentation on the French horn, but then I also gave a preview to a concert series. I believe it was the November series for the Terre Haute Symphony Orchestra. But in terms of a pure presentation, yes, this is my second time. So just to have a little backstory in terms of what we'll be talking about today. I have a very small background in composition, but then that has turned into an interest and love for making arrangements or transcriptions of pieces. And so from that experience and background, I've kind of stumbled into this piece, and I'll give a little bit of the background for the composer in the piece just to kind of set why this type of work is important and how we get to the point where, 130 years later, 40 years later, how do we not have a published score for a work like this? So the first thing is that, who is Franz Strauss? So he's often overshadowed by his son, Richard Strauss, who many people know from his tone poems. He's got some wonderful lieder as well. And so that's kind of, he gets the spotlight in terms of the son does most of the time. But Franz Strauss in his own right was an incredible musician. He, in terms of, if you think about the top of the class in terms of, let's say, solo violin players and currently alive, we're talking about the Perlmans, we're talking about the Hilary Hahn, those types of elite level of solo players. Franz Strauss was that kind of player for his day and age. Now, through time, we don't necessarily hear about them as much. And he, between all the things that he has done, his compositions are what he's most well known for. And he also taught, but he part of his playing career was with the Bavarian State Opera, and through that he was actually he was able to premiere many of Wagner's operas. Actually, now it's written in correspondences between him, between Strauss and others. Wagner and Strauss didn't get along very well, but Wagner would say, "Well, he's just so good at horn, I can't get rid of him." So he's a very, very good horn player. And then we play a number of his pieces, we being horn players. There's a Nocturne, which is a short piece with piano. And Franz Strauss also wrote a first horn concerto that is very well known among a few other pieces. He also was a conductor and a teacher, but for these purposes, we'll focus mostly on Franz Strauss as a composer. So now getting into why this work, why does this type of finding manuscripts and making them into scores matter? Well, the first thing is that the history of the horn as a solo instrument, whenever it was first introduced into the orchestra around the Baroque and the classical time eras in terms of classical music, concerto was a huge prominent aspect of any time, like in a court. If you had a court opera or a court orchestra going on, they would perform for the the count or whoever the nobility was, and it's like, oh, we have this fantastic flute player or horn player or violinist, and they would write these pieces for them to highlight that. Well, this is one of the ways they could do that, is to write concerti for it. So within the Baroque period and classical period, we have countless concerti. So from Baroque, there are names like Reinhardt and Quantz. Quantz is quite well known, and Grun and Rolling are all very, for their time period, very well known. Now, Quantz is probably the only one that most people have heard of, because Bach and the other Telemann, the other individuals kind of overshadow some of these other composers. But during the classical period, we have 4 concertos from Mozart, we have 4 concertos from 2 concertos from Haydn. Within the French The French style, we have Duprat and Duvernay, who also both have 5 concerti for horn. Rossetti has at least 5, and some of those, Antonio Rossetti, many of those have been lost. So we have this dozens and dozens of these horn concerti that are really important to the repertoire. But then when we get to the Romantic period, that all slows down. We have, I when I researched this, off the top of my head, I could think of 2 concerti, Franz Strauss' first concerto and the Weber concertino. Those are the only 2 that I could think of right off the top of my head. There are a few other ones that I know of, but don't know as well. So it's slim pickings. Part of that is because if we think about it, the symphony became such a huge thing. And if we think about some of the repertoire that the horn players get to play within the symphony, there's some really good pieces and that the horn players are playing, where it's like, think about the Tchaikovskys or the Beethoven pieces, like Beethoven's 3 through 9. There's some great horn writing there. And so the focus sidestepped from writing concerti for horns and writing horn playing in the whole orchestra. And so we have far fewer concerti for the repertoire. Now, that's kind of the reason why this piece is important, because this falls directly into that Romantic period, and which can bolster the repertoire for any horn players. And here's the interesting story as to how I came about and how it's important, is that manuscripts aren't just sitting on shelves at any library you can find. And what I mean by manuscript is I mean the original copy made by the composer, or something very close to that, one of the original copies that they wrote. Oftentimes they're handwritten, and we'll talk about what the challenges are that come from handwritten scores. And so what ended up happening was, I didn't know this piece existed about 4 or 5 years ago. And as a class project during my doctorate, this piece was assigned to me because Strauss wrote a piano reduction for this piece. And so, we'll play from this piano reduction that had been first published really in the I believe it was 1980s, 1990s. And if you saw from the previous screen, Franz Strauss passed away in 1905. So we're looking at an additional 70, maybe even 80 years past that until the first publication even came out. So I played from this piano reduction, and I was like, this is very interesting, never heard of this work. And so I started a rabbit trail of where is this piece, where is it at? Why don't we have, an updated edition of it? Why isn't it published? From here, I'll shorten the story considerably, and that eventually I found that the manuscript was at the Richard Strauss Institute in Germany. And so I was able to contact the director at the institute, and then through him received permission from the Strauss family to obtain the manuscript to make a score. And so in the fall of 2018, I had a performance with orchestra where I was the soloist. And to my knowledge, this was the first time in North America that this piece has ever been performed. So it's like I had the opportunity to have the manuscript and then work from there to make this score so we could make a performance from it. So with that kind of background to it, first things first, I talked about before, legibility. Legibility is a huge issue when it comes to written manuscripts, because most of these manuscripts are going to end up being, from this time period, are going to be handwritten. And this is 3 measures from the violin part from I believe the first movement, in which if you're looking in here, it's like, okay, this first measure, I think there's some naturals on the 3rd beat and maybe some naturals on the 4th beat in there. It takes some time to decipher exactly, okay, how many ledger lines are there? The computer software didn't exist. And so we don't have these clean scores that are often used today. And a lot of the time, the performers back then also performed from handwritten scores. And so there was a skill to this in which they were able to perform from what we would consider less legible, but maybe not as illegible as what we would consider it. So, and that's just three measures of this whole score, and there's hundreds of measures in the piece and a whole orchestra of instruments that you have to go through and figure out exactly which one. So, you got to see, okay, am I inputting the right notes and the right durations and all of the articulations and whatnot? The first real big artistic decision that I really had to make whenever making the score was omitted sections. So in the score, there's actually portions where you can see where things were erased. Sections were erased, or Strauss changed his mind. We don't know exactly that process just because he's not around to ask. So, and from that, you kind of have to figure, okay, what am I going to include? What am I not going to include? And so this is actually a picture of the original manuscript. And this is from the first movement. So the piece starts with a kind of a introduction from the orchestra and then starts right off with the cadenza from the horn, which is not super common up to this point until you start thinking about some of the piano concerto by Liszt. He kind of changed the game and put concerti cadenzas right at the beginning. So if we look at this first section, these first four measures prior to the horn part coming in, and I've zoomed in for the second aspect, this is all erased. And so you have to think, okay, am I going to include this? And these instruments, these are the trumpets, the trombone, and the timpani from the top down. And so you have to make that decision, like, okay, am I going to include this? Is this not important? How do I make that decision? For myself, I went ahead and made throughout this score, I made the decision to not include the erased parts, and that, okay, I'm going to say this was probably Strauss making those adjustments. I don't know for certain. I know that he wrote, this is his handwriting, but I don't know if he made those adjustments. So I just went with the assumption that it was, and I'm going to go with what was written on the page. So then going through and say, okay, I'm just going to put whatever's like written in ink. So then now we get the second question of articulations, because again, I don't know how long Strauss had where he was writing this. Maybe he wrote it in a month or 2 weeks, or he took a whole year to write it. I don't know. And so the format of the whole concerto, it's really one long movement with quick changes in between the sections. But for the purposes of today, we'll consider it a 3-movement concerto, which is very common, and an A-B-A prime. And what I mean by that is that the first section is fast and quick and jolly in its character. The second section is slower. It changes time. It changes the key signature as well. And then this third section goes back to the first, what we're calling movement, and it's back to this very jolly section. Well, when you have the first and the third movements that are so similar in many ways, in the score, there are discrepancies in the manuscript between articulations. And so I had to make the decision, okay, where am I going to change? Like, am I going to use one option or the other? And it really goes into, okay, is this just one mess up, or did Strauss really mean that? So here's an example. This is from the solo horn part in the first movement. And these figures, it's all triplet eighth notes, but the slur goes from, if you go ta-ta-ee, ta-ta-ta. So we have articulations on the second and third notes of this second beat on this first figure. But on the second figure, there's only articulations on the last note. And so I had to think, it's like, okay, is this an accident? Is this meant to be this way? Is there some, it feels like there might be some inconsistencies. And so the process actually came from me playing it a considerable amount of times where I was like play through. It's like, does this feel right for this portion? Does this is it clear? Does it take away from the piece? And in the end, I believe the final version of this, and I actually copied the second figure for the first figure. So you articulate the first and the last notes of each figure, and then I slurred for these second through fifth notes. So another example is here. We have the first movement, and these are, like I said, between the A, B, A prime. These are taken from the first and third movements. So there's some very similar, in this case, identical passages. And this is almost the very beginning of the passages for the third movement, and then after the cadenza for the first movement. Well, this first beat is articulated in the third movement, where this first beat of the first movement is not articulated, it's slurred. And so this is another example of, okay, do I want to maintain the same feeling from the first movement and copy that to the third movement? Do I change it altogether? And so in this case, I used the first movement and copied it to the third movement in terms of articulation to match for each one. This is actually one of the most difficult sections to make these distinctions, because the differences are so great between them. So this in the section, these movements are in 4/4 time, but they have a tripleted section, which is actually occurs in Franz Strauss's first concerto. So it's something that he's done before. It's pretty common to see this. And so, but between the two movements, the articulation is wildly different, and the character becomes very different as well. If I'm slurring all the way through most of it, or do I have this articulated aspect to it in the second figure? Well, not only are we fighting, am I fighting my decisions against what makes sense for me playing it or anyone playing it, but then also what is common practice for articulation. And for horn playing, this slur to and then tongue afterwards is quite common. We can see that in most of the Mozart horn concerti have this slur and then tongue afterwards. And so that's a common articulation. This articulated and then slur the whole time, less so. That's not as common. And so whenever I made the decision here, I actually took the articulation from the third movement and then made it for the first movement, because it made it more clear, and we have this a little bit more common of a gesture from it. And then this is the last example that I have, which there are plenty others, where, okay, the style, and that's the other thing, is that the character of these pieces can change, of the sections can change pretty dramatically if we don't consider how we're going to make those adjustments. And so in this case, da-ti-ya-ta-ta is the top version, where we just articulate the last note in this triplet, or ta-ti-ta-ta-ta do we articulate after the tie. And again, this slur with the last note tongued is quite common. The second one is also common. So these are the considerations that we have to make whenever you're making a new score from a manuscript. There's no one to ask. There's really not, we don't have that kind of availability to be like, oh, let's see who so-and-so says. Or if there's scholarship, then sure. There's new editions that come out of pieces that are quite popular. People will have tons of opinions on how certain things should be made in terms of the score. But in this case, I didn't have anyone to ask. It was just making my own decisions And so I believe in this case, I used the first movement because this section is quite fast. And so it's a little bit, flows a bit more for the performance of it. And then, so then with the, I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation where this piece was written with a full score, with an orchestra, but at the same time, a piano reduction was made. So Franz Strauss made both. A lot of the, like say, the Mozart Concerti or some of the other earlier works, it was never intended to be played with piano because at that time, the pianoforte that we think of didn't exist. The horn would absolutely obliterate a celeste or any of the other earlier keyboards, and so the matching wouldn't really work very well. But after Beethoven's day, the pianoforte had a bit more substance to it. So then pairing with the brass instrument could actually happen. And so on top of just having these different articulations between the manuscript score of the orchestra, I also had to make decisions between the piano reduction that Strauss did as well. And so here's one of the biggest differences is that if you look at these two lines, the top and the bottom, there's not a lot that's similar about them. They're pretty different in terms of the notes and the articulations. And that's kind of odd because this is the exact same section in the concerto. If you see the solo horn manuscript, this first measure that is written as solo lines up with the third measure in the piano reduction that Strauss made. So, okay, so now Strauss has completely changed the melody for this piece. So it's like, okay, so which melody do I go with? And after this measure, these four measures, things kind of line up again. And so it's not, the entire melody is not abandoned whenever making the piano reduction, but in this case, there's some slight differences. And so with that, I had to make, okay, which one do I go with? Obviously, both are from Strauss. I have to figure out, okay, whenever I'm performing this with the orchestra, what's going to make the most sense? Having played through both, in the end, I ended up using what was in the manuscript, the solo part from the manuscript, because I felt like it flowed a little bit better to my ear. It didn't sound as haphazardly as the piano reduction did. And so it just sounded nicer. So those are just a few of the things that come through with the piano reduction aspect, like coming from, not the piano reduction, from the manuscript, just transferring it into an orchestral score. But then past that, whenever we're working with the computer formatting, the software that we use, the sky's the limit because, okay, how thick of the ledger lines do I want? How thick of the stems on the notes do I want? How about the bar lines? How thick do I want those to be? And then, okay, well, what size of the font do I want? What style of font do I want? Times New Roman is sometimes as a default. I'm not a huge fan of using Times New Roman, but some people use it. I use Palantino as my preferred font. And then, okay, so what about the size of the parts? Do I print on 8.5 by 11? Do I print on 11 by 14? Do I make it a huge 11 by 17 score for, let's say a conductor? So it's like, okay, how there's these issues to be taken up. Well, in addition, what about spacing between the notes? Do I cram as much music, black ink as I can onto one page? And then that way I'm printing on fewer pages, or do I space it out? And then I've put in here also the direction of the note stems can make a difference in how well it's read. Now, for horn players who play one note at a time, most of the time, it's not as an issue, but in terms of, let's say, a piano who plays multiple notes at the same time, how the notes appear on the page makes a big difference in how well it's read. A lot of times with these finished scores, we're like that are published and sold, we buy them and like, okay, yeah, it's a score. And it's not until we find a score that's not well done, they're like, oh, wow, this is not very well. You can't read this very well. So that really helps with being able to read everything. And there's so many different hundreds and hundreds of different decisions that can be made. I personally have a set of rules, let's say, that I upload into each score. So that way I don't have to go through and pick, okay, how exactly thick do I want each stem to be. I have these preset, so that way I don't have to make that decision every single time I make a new score. So on top of that, this manuscript has also turned into a project of making a piano reduction as well. And the reason why I'm going through and making a piano reduction is, one, the piano reduction that Strauss did, as we already noted, is different. There's differences between them. So I first wanted to emulate a piano reduction of the orchestral manuscript, but then secondly, a piano reduction will help in terms of the piece being more well-known. Not everybody has a orchestra in their back pocket. They're like, hey, I'm just going to go perform this piece. It would be great, but that's not something that that's possible. And so, but it's much easier to employ a pianist and work with them to perform some of these large, really important works that are not as accessible otherwise. So whenever we think about having a piano reduction, so it's now I'm looking at a full score of orchestra, and how do I make that down into what can fit into two hands? That's it. So the first thing you got to consider is, what are we imitating? What are the forces? Are we imitating a string quartet? Are we imitating a full orchestra with 90 members? Are we, are we doing like a brass choir? You know, it depends. And so that also factors into, how do I reduce this down for the pianist? The other thing is, what can we fit between the two hands? I can't have things spanning more than a ninth or an octave, and some people have smaller hands, so you know, a ninth or 10th might be more difficult. And so those are considerations that need to be those are things that need to be taken into consideration. And then also, what can pianos do and not do? Strings and wind instruments can crescendo on one note because we have air that sustains the note. Pianos can't. If you press the piano, it decays immediately because piano is a percussion instrument. And so because it decays immediately, if I want to write a crescendo under a whole note on a piano, it's not going to crescendo at all. So in that case, maybe I do a tremolo, so they alternate between the notes and then crescendo from that. There are other ways. So there are things that you have to take into consideration that a piano can or can't do that are emulating within the orchestral score. So I'm going to take four measures here, and we're going to kind of look through what it might look like within piano reduction. So these are four measures. The first four measures after the cadenza at the very beginning, and these are the string parts. So we have first violins, second violins, violas and divisi, and cello and bass. Cello and bass at this time match each other a lot. They're mostly in octaves, sound in octaves. And so there's a lot going on here. We have the syncopation within the second violin and the violas, and then this leaping, cascading first violin part. At the same time, we also have the winds. We have, going from the bottom up, we have a timpani, trombone, two trumpets, two horns, two bassoons, two clarinets, two oboes, two clarinets, and one flute. And so in here, it's mostly just held out chords. There's some accents here within the brass, so maybe some punches that come through, but this constant rumbling from the timpani. Well, so we have, this is what our strings parts look like. This is what our wind parts look like. This is what it looks like in the Strauss piano reduction. Interesting. So what he chose to do is these 4 measures have been reduced down to what are the chords? What chords are happening? And these slashes means that it's just repeated eighth notes underneath the whole thing. So we get these repeated eighth notes going on, and we get the cello and the bass kind of keep us grounded with their rhythms here. Well, if we look back, we lose all of the winds, and we lose the woodwinds and the brass. We don't hear any of that other than just what are the chord types. Not to mention this melody of sorts from the violins. We lose all of that. So I chose to go a different path with my reduction. So we still have the cello and bass, albeit they're in a lower octave, and then in order to maintain the viola portion and the second violins, there's the syncopation going along as well. Well, some of those violas and second violins play on the downbeat, the big beats 1 and 3. Well, if the pianist is all the way down here hitting this low note, this low B flat, they can't also then play this C and E flat at the same time. So these are decisions where it's like I have to like omit this first eighth note in order for the pianist to actually jump up to play those notes. In this case, since there is a rest and this third beat of the third measure, I don't have to do that where this breaks the rhythm because the pianist is not jumping down to those lower notes. I also found it really important to maintain the solo, the first violin part, the kind of the melody. It's not necessarily a melody that one would whistle down while walking down the street, but it does have some shape to it that kind of moves the piece along. So with that, you want to emulate with the piano reduction and the way that you present it within the score. Also notice here's a manuscript. It's kind of slanted a little bit, and the notes are, you can make them out, but they're not as clear as they maybe could be. Going into, okay, this is the same time, just for piano, a little bit easier to read. Things are a little bit more vertical. And then we go into this, which is computer software. If I wrote this by hand, it'd be worse than the manuscript. I just have terrible handwriting. So thankfully, we have computers that can do that for us. So this is quite clear, and it's much easier to read. There's less question about, okay, what note am I actually playing at any given time? Whenever we're making these piano reductions, we want to try and emulate the orchestra part as much as possible. That's you don't want to necessarily, we have to condense it down a little bit. In that this previous slide, there aren't any wind parts. I had to make the decisions like, okay, between the winds and the strings, the wind part doesn't stick out as much to me. And so I made the decision that, okay, if I can't do everything. And that's another thing that you run into, is that if you try and do a piano reduction that does everything, it doesn't sound very good. There are some editions of some famous concerti, I won't name them, but that they just put everything on them. And the pianists have to parse through. It's like, okay, I'm going to omit this. I'm not going to do this, just to make it playable. And unfortunately, that's not terribly uncommon. Newer editions don't do that. They go for the playing edition. It's like, okay, so it's easier for the pianist to play. We like to take care of our pianists because they take care of us. So with that, we want the piano to sound like as much as the orchestra as possible. So what we'll do is we'll listen to about a minute first of the this is actually from the 2018 a performance with orchestra. So younger me, better looking me, but that's okay. And we'll listen to about it's the same section. So this will be starting right where we were looking at those measures, where they right after the cadenza. All right, so we'll stop right there. Now, as just before we move on to the piano reduction, I want to go back and listen to the last few, those first few measures. All right, so that's what we're trying to emulate. That's the idea. And so let's see, how well does that sound within the piano? Does it sound similar or different? And this was taken from a performance actually earlier this school year, so in the fall of 2021, at the university that I teach at, and with Aram Arkalayan, who's actually on faculty at IU. He and I work together quite regularly, but Indiana University. So, so the idea here is that a little bit similar. Obviously, within this, you hear the solo line up above, and then this kind of rumbling down where this the chords are kind of played below in that section. Ooh. And so at the end of it all, this is what the piano reduction looks like for that section. Here, these first, so this is page 2 of the score. These first 4 measures are from the cadenza. And then we start here as we move along through and hear that violin part in the right hand in the treble clef. And then as it kind of slows down into the solo line for and just like we talked about earlier, I chose to go with the manuscript of that portion here rather than going with what the piano reduction had from Strauss himself. But I tried to emulate as much as possible, where using what the orchestra sounds like, and often that means that there's much more for the pianist to do, but as long as it's possible and not outside the realm of it's not in, as long as it's not impossible, most of the times they're willing to work with it. So, questions?
On our side. Does anybody have any questions out on Zoom? That was a lot of information to get through. So I think that, oh, wait a minute. I do have a question. Give me a second. Let me unplug.
Sure.
As a pianist, it was fascinating looking at the music, the scores as you were talking about it, and then hearing it, how you could put those together with the revisions and stuff and make it all make sense. Is just amazing. So really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And full disclosure, my piano background in terms of my ability to play is really just through undergrad, through a bachelor's degree in which piano skills are required. But I drew heavily on my composition side, where saying, okay, is this possible? Is this within the hands? And then on top of that, Aram, who you saw in the performance, I bounced these, I brought this to him and say, okay, what works, what doesn't work? Here are my thoughts. Because there are other portions where I was torn. I was torn between, okay, how reduced do I make this? Do I leave out, a certain line? Do I leave out the violas, the second violins, or the winds, or the brass? And so it's like, okay, what do you think of this? And then through that, so he was a great resource to help kind of firm up some ideas and make it so that, well, in the end, he was the first person to perform it, so he made it easier on himself by making that. But thank you.
Okay. Other questions, comments? Anybody out on Zoom that has any questions or comments? No, I think we have a much better appreciation of what all it takes in order to do that, though, because I actually have never given it a lot. I am not a musician, so I've never given a lot of thought as to how do you change what was originally out there in order to add other instruments to it or to kind of change that composition. So I think you did a fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No. Well, I think we're good. Thank you so very much. Everybody, please help me thank Layne for his presentation. I don't know if you can hear our applause, but we're applauding. Yes. So thank you so very, very much. And we'll be seeing you soon at one of the symphony concerts.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending. And we'll be seeing you soon at our next presentation. Thank you.